When you're done listening to the best mind in CS, my own, you probably want to listen to some of the other great minds in CS. And over at Boomio, they have a whole bunch of video content by some of the great thinkers, some of the great minds of CS. So at the moment, I actually just went and I had a look at a series they have on the fundamentals of how to play Cash by Adren, the former iBUYPOWER player, the former Team Liquid player. Before that, way back, Curse NA. And he is someone where, regardless of how his pro career went, and when he did and didn't play the in-game leading role, has always been one of the best minds for CS, actually. He's always someone where if you watch his stream, and you watch the smokes he comes up with, and the way he explains them, he's the ideal person to break down the fundamentals for people who want to learn and improve at the game, because he's someone who has a very good mind for how these things work and why you do them. So you can go over there and watch his video series on that. Now, iBUYPOWER being banned is often cited, whether as a team or the individual players, as an excuse or a reason as to why the North American region isn't as good as Europe, or isn't better than it could be, or doesn't have the qualities that you'd want from it in a scene. So I actually feel like this is a difficult topic to talk about, because it feels like the fact that people know those players are banned and therefore they will never be involved in the scene, most likely, it's a way to put all your hopes and dreams onto them and be like, oh, this is why it's an excuse. Oh, if they just weren't banned, these problems wouldn't be here, or they wouldn't be as bad and things would be better. And by now they've figured it all out. And that takes it too far. That really is a stretch. And even as a reason, it wouldn't be top 3 of my reasons, really, as to why a lot of the issues aren't fixed in the NA scene. There are many, many problems, and there are more than enough players, and players as good as those ones that were banned now, at this point in time, that's not a good enough excuse as to why the NA scene hasn't gotten further and isn't very, very good right now. We could absolutely have done as much and more with the players that are available now, and the situation in terms of salaries that are available now, the resources, and the amount of time that now experienced people who weren't at the top back then have had. So, I mean, funnily enough, they were Saviours, in as much as Saviour was the in-game name of a famous Korean Brood War player who was very good and who got banned for match fixing. So, I mean, that's kind of funny in itself. But they weren't Saviours, the iBUYPOWER guys, as a team or players, in the context of NA and the things that hold NA back. So to really explain this, I have to kind of explain the context of the best iBUYPOWER, the best lineup that they had, and what really, if we're being fair, was the expectations for that team before we transition it into the rest of the NA scene. So the best lineup they had was the one that was DaZeD, Swag, Skadoodle, AZK, and Steel. And DaZeD was the in-game leader, and Skadoodle was the AWPer. Now, this particular lineup was a top 2 NA team back when there really only were 2 top NA teams, which was Cloud9 and iBUYPOWER. I always thought they were the better team in terms of the pieces, but in terms of actual placings, it's real hard to tell, because the complexity lineup before that had Swag in managed to get top 4 at the first major. The Cloud9 lineup I actually thought could have potentially won ESL1 Clone, which is right slap in the middle of the prime of this iBUYPOWER lineup. So I think it's real touch and go as to which one of the 2 teams was actually the better NA team. In terms of international play in general, it was Cloud9. In terms of domestic play and the potential to do more, hinted at by occasional international results, it was the iBUYPOWER guys. So it really wasn't even clear-cut there. So that alone should tell you something about why these guys weren't just the saviors and the gods, and if they'd have just stayed, everything would be fine. Because even their rivals at times outperformed them. At the majors, for example, iBUYPOWER, none of their lineups ever got out of the group stage of a major. Likewise, iBUYPOWER could beat top Europeans at home on American soil, didn't often do it when it got to the international play, whereas internationally, Cloud9 usually would lose to iBUYPOWER domestically and wouldn't do as well at most of the ESEA lands, but they'd be the team that were the dominant NA team. I mean, not really dominant, but they were the better NA team internationally and at majors, etc. So already you can see by the fact there was a different distinct group, many of whom, Hiko, Skadoodle, Shroud, went on to later success in different lineups, including some of the best placings NA's ever had, winning ESL Pro League. Obviously, Hiko going to the final of the major. Who else would there be? Sean Gares having those top 3 second places in Europe. You know, they accomplished a fair amount themselves separate from the iBUYPOWER group. So it's not as though you haven't had results because iBUYPOWER were banned. It's not as though iBUYPOWER were the only players and the only hopes. So in that sense, it is stretched. So let's look at what this iBUYPOWER lineup, the best lineup they ever had, actually accomplished. And what you'll find out is this is an example of how complicated it is, especially if you weren't there at the time, to look back on results and try and interpret them and figure out the context. Because actually, some of the results that iBUYPOWER lineup had were worse than the result might suggest, and some of them were better. So, okay, let's start out. One of the first things they accomplished with that particular lineup was they won ESEA Season 16. Actually, let me just double check. Is that actually the right one? I want to just double check this, because I want to get this 100% right. So we're going to go through all their time, the majors, everything they did. Let's just have a quick look at this one. So ESEA Season 16 was the one where, yes, this is when they had just got swag and they'd added steel. So getting swag actually was the move that kind of solidified them as like they're the ones who were putting most of the eggs in the basket, as it were. People thought this is going to degrade Cloud9, because Cloud9 ended up going ahead and getting Shroud, who at the time they didn't have at this LAN. That's right, they had Anger at this LAN, who'd been a former iBUYPOWER player, who was the one who was kicked out for him. So actually Cloud9 looked at the ones who were going to suffer, even though ironically they would be the ones who'd go on to have the better placing at the major. So at this tournament, ESEA Season 16. Now ESEA Season 15 at the beginning of the year, so this is like the beginning of the summer. At the beginning of the year, ESEA Season 15, iBUYPOWER had won, but that's when they had a Dren, that's when they had Anger in the lineup, that's before they had swag, that's before they had steel, and that was the one where they'd beaten Titan, but there's all sorts of fuckery at that one. Like, first of all, not a lot of top European teams went to that one. That's the one where people like Nip were, to some degree, like boycotting it or whatever, didn't want to go. Then you had a scenario where I have spoken to some of the Titan players, people like Shocks, because they came from the upper bracket, were pretty much fucking around. Like, they had supposedly had music going on in their headphones as they were playing the first best of three of the final, and the first best of three was very, very close. But let's ignore that, because that's not this lineup. So ESEA Season 16 comes around, they've got the lineup in place that's going to be the best one of iBUYPOWER. Now here's the problem, they win this LAN as well, but first of all, it's on American soil. This team showed a propensity to do better at home on American soil than internationally in Europe. That was the only place we played internationally at the time. Now, the issue with that is, part of the reason why it's not even just the home soil thing that might have been helping them, ESEA LAN famously didn't have a crowd set up. They didn't have a stage set up. It was like playing in the tournament area the entire tournament. So as a result, a lot of the nerves, a lot of the pressure, a lot of those big issues that stop people. That's one of the reasons I've always thought at majors a lot of teams don't perform that well once they get to the playoffs if they're not elite level teams. It's because those external factors get to you, and that kind of signifies that you're the highest rung of the ladder. And if you want to make that climb, you have to overcome performance anxiety, the crowd cheering against you, knowing you're going against legendary players who are vets and who are totally accustomed to this climate, losing a big clutch in front of everyone, and that all plays a part, and that wasn't relevant at ESEA LANs. So winning ESEA LAN Season 16 already is less impressive than winning the same tournament of teams in a European setting with a big stage setting. But with that said, there's another piece of context you have to add here, which brings down some of the glamour of winning that tournament, which is that the three best European teams in attendance was Virtus.pro, obviously champions, reigning champions of the previous major, Katowice. Ninjas in Pajamas, legendary team, had never failed to place top 4 events. I think they were on something like 31 event streak, admittedly including domestic tournaments. And Na'Vi. And Na'Vi had just shown really great form in managing to finish second at DreamHack Summer, and they had also won Star Ladder, I think it was 9. I believe it was 9 over teams like Virtus.pro, Titan, NIP, and Guardian was hard carrying at this point in time and was a real one-man army. So those 3 teams on paper, if you finish ahead of them and win the tournament, that's awesome, right? Problem is, we've got a few factors here. First of all, that event actually marked the beginning of the NIP slump. From there on, they just got worse and worse, and they were never elite level, really. They were only touch and go every now and then. Then you got to add in Virtus.pro, reigning major champions, right? Problem is, Virtus.pro had a situation where, I didn't look at which player it was, I forget. It was either Snacks or Bialy, and he had a situation where, due to some sort of family problem at home, he travelled, and as far as I remember, I think he played the first best of 3 series, which is the one that they lost to iBUYPOWER at some point. He played the one. I think he played it on the same day as he arrived in America off his plane, because he came separate to the rest of his team. So that in itself makes the Virtus.pro results a bit more wonky. Then you've got to add in that for Na'Vi, Edward had some sort of like a visa problem, I believe, and he arrived sort of, last minute almost as well, and there was extenuating circumstances there, and I think they were even going to use like Senya or something initially in the tournament. So when you add all this stuff together, 2 of the 3 teams already have literal extenuating circumstances, and NIP themselves, we found out later, weren't as good. Add in as a third factor, this is where it's really unfortunate, I always feel bad for teams who win the tournament, but there are upsets on the other side of the bracket. Because you'll never get as much credit, because even though you won the tournament, you didn't beat those better teams. Someone else did it for you, and then you beat them, a lesser team, hence why it was an upset. Now, the problem is, this tournament was full of upsets, and most of them came at the hands of the guys from Complexity. This is just before they joined Cloud9, so it was technically Complexity, but that was basically the same core that went into Cloud9. And at this tournament, it was Complexity that beat NIP, beat Na'Vi, beat Virtus.pro, and therefore played the guys from iBUYPOWER in the winners bracket final, lost to them, and then met them in the final from the lower bracket. Now, yes, iBUYPOWER beat Virtus.pro. Yeah, they did that one. Even then, though, a circumstance that needs to be added in, third map was a 16-14 win on Season, a map that Europe did not play at all and was in 0 European competitions. Then they go to the final and they're waiting there. Now, under normal circumstances, yes, NIP, Na'Vi, or VP would meet them in the final. iBUYPOWER would get a chance to potentially beat the top level European team, and therefore if they'd won the event then, they'd get even more props. Unfortunately, Complexity beat out those teams, had some amazing games there, and it was Complexity who played them, their fellow NA team, and as always happened in their rivalry in NA, iBUYPOWER were able to beat Complexity on LAN, two top NA teams playing, and iBUYPOWER tended to be the counter when they played each other. So they won the tournament. So that one in itself, yeah, it's an international win, but there's a lot of asterisks next to it, more than 1 or 2. It's a lot you have to consider for that one. So going forwards, then they had Gfinity G3, which was a week or 2 before the major. It was in the beginning of August. And this was an international tournament. It was admittedly the first Gfinity in CS, and it was in London. And the problem is, in the group stage, this is an event actually where iBUYPOWER arguably did better than the result said, because the result says they just came 5th to 8th. But in the group stage, they were in a bunch of games where it was really close and where they were close to actually like beating out big teams, and they did get some upsets. And the problem is there was a lot of computer issues, there was lag issues, and these made some of these results so that they didn't win all the maps that they were in positional upset. So I will admit they could have gotten a better group stage result and therefore a more favourable first round opponent. Unfortunately, losing some of those close maps, which weren't necessarily all their fault, put them in a situation where in the first round of the playoffs, the 5th to 8th round, they played against Titan, and this was Titan with Kenny S. And Kenny S at the time was one of the MVP candidates to the tournament. They would go on to play second in the tournament. They were really good at the time. This was a world-class team. And unfortunately, despite a close game on DOS 2, where Skadoodle was going off in the first half, after that, Titan just cleans them up. It's a 2-0, and we move on to them going out 5th to 8th, and Titan goes to the final. Could have won the tournament even. So that one, I actually do feel a bit bad for the iBUYPOWER guys. I think in terms of performance, with a different opponent, they absolutely could have come top 4 there, and therefore it would have been certainly very interesting, but they got exactly the wrong opponent, and they also ended up in a scenario, like for example, they had someone who was a better AWPer than their AWPer, who was the star of their team, Skadoodle, and they had a team who was a better tactical team, and who, in general, had a better sense for how to play the map pool at the time. The iBUYPOWER guys were more limited and needed a specific type of opponent, as they would later get with LDLC, as we'll find out. So then we go to the major, though. And the problem is, iBUYPOWER famously, in the 2 previous majors with different lineups, never got out of the group stage. Doesn't matter how good they looked before, doesn't matter how much they beat Cloud9 and Complexity before, never get out of the group stage. So they come to this major, they don't get out of the group stage. But this one has extenuating circumstances. The other group stages, I don't give a fuck. No excuses on those other 2. They fucked them up. They weren't good enough internationally. They had a mixture of chokers. I actually thought that Anger was a great example of choker, and Adren had his issues. They were a team that weren't as good as they were in this era, and then they added in that their practice methods were terrible before, so they were wrecking everyone in scrims, came to the majors in the past, and then just bombed it on European soil. Now you come to this major, and yes, I do think they underperformed because of the fact that they were in Europe, it was the major and all the pressure was there. They clearly had some issues in that sense. But I will say, go ahead and look at this group stage, and I don't blame them for this one. I'll give them a break on this one, because the group stage for this one, remember, it's the same group stage system that we had until recently, where you get the number one seed is one of the teams that finished top 4 at the last major, so that was Virtus.pro. They got the champions of the previous major, and coming into this major, Virtus.pro's just won Gfinity G3. So they're also the most dangerous Pool 1 team you could get. Then, number 2 seed is a team that finished 5th to 8th at the last major. Now, this is where they got incredibly unfortunate, because the second team that they got, the Pool 2 team that iBUYPOWER was given, was Fnatic. And Fnatic, this is the second event at which they had olofmeister and Crims. And not only were they bodying online play, but they had just made top 4 at the last tournament, Gfinity G3. And we know in this tournament, they would actually go on to come second place, and they would go on to be a few rounds from winning the major outright against NIP in that amazing final. But Fnatic was arguably the worst team you could have gotten here, since they just did an upgrade. So they earned their Pool 2 performance with the old lineup, with Devilwalk and Schneider, where they made it to the first round of Katowice, and then they lost in a super close third map to LGB, Dennis Olofmeister Crims. And now they come in, and they've got in theory a seed worse than arguably their level, and this is who the iBUYPOWER guys have drawn. Instead, they could have drawn Hellraisers. Now, at the time, Hellraisers has been gradually going downhill. They haven't dropped off a cliff completely yet, but they would be very beatable in a group stage. They could have had Cloud9, a team they always beat, typically. That's another team you really want to play against at this point in time. So instead, they get Fnatic. Or the third team they could have had is LDLC, who admittedly at this tournament had a really good run, but up until that point looked like they were the best of the tier 2. They weren't quite necessarily ready to enter elite status. Tier 1 had less teams in it because we had less top teams overall. So all these teams would be preferable to having Virtus.pro, because Fnatic rather, because obviously we know that Fnatic with olofmeister and Crims went on to be gods and went on to go second place in this major. Especially at majors, they were gods. So a third detail about this tournament that makes it fucked up is not only do you get Fnatic, not only do you get Virtus.pro, so that's done already. And remember, it was best of ones back then. There was no best of 3 decider. Not only do you get 2 top teams, but you get the randomizer was in effect. And Cobblestone and Overpass had just been added for this tournament and had never been played in competitive play before. And at this tournament, when they played against Fnatic, they randomed Cobblestone. This is old Cobblestone before the rework. So before you came to the broken wall bit on B, there was a separate area that had a missing area of the wall. And so this was so ridiculously CT-sided as a map, and they randomed it against Fnatic, and they just lost to Fnatic. So already, the chances to get out that group, quite low. So let's go on from that. Then we had this tournament. I'll skip over the domestic lands because they had some weird ones there where they won like Sevo, for example, but then they lost this best of 1 to Denial at like GXL or whatever the fuck. I've never heard an explanation for that one, but we'll ignore those for the moment. Then we go to FaceIt Season 2. Now, at FaceIt Season 2, not to be confused with Stage 2, which was the year after when TSM won against Cloud9. FaceIt Season 2 was the first LAN finals that FaceIt had. The other one had been online for Season 1. So Season 2 was the one where it was held in Milan in Italy. And you had... That was the first big event that the Fnatic lineup I just talked about won. That's what kick-started the Fnatic era. That's the first one in their run of 3 big tournaments that made them this dominant force. And at this tournament, iBUYPOWER made the first international final outside of NA of a top NA team because they made it second place. So in the group stage, they beat up Dignitas, who was a team who was, Device, Dupree, very good team, and considered elite level. They'd finished top 4 at the last major. Then they played very close against Fnatic, but lost. They got out of the group, and in the playoffs, in the semis, they played against LDLC. Now, LDLC, obviously the guys who later became Envious, would actually go on to win the next major, became a very, very good team after this tournament. We already had the pieces together, sort of. Now, in this, they managed to beat them on Dust 2 and Inferno, arguably the 2 best maps for iBUYPOWER. And the Inferno game's an epic one, because on this Inferno game, it's the one where they go like treble overtime or something, and DaZeD himself actually drops 50, and they win this series in epic fashion, go to the final, and in the final, they were actually close to going to 5 maps with Fnatic. They managed to win, I think it was Dust 2, and they lost the other maps, I mean, Fnatic were godlike on Inferno, admittedly. And a key last map was a 16-14 loss on Nuke, a map that Fnatic didn't play, but they managed to do this ridiculous comeback on the T side of. And so they finished second at that tournament. This is the tournament that everyone thinks of and thinks of, well, they beat the team that eventually became the major champions and they really showed something internationally. Yeah, they did. The problem is, right after that, not long after, we had ESWC. And at ESWC, they got to top 8. That's it. Now, that wasn't bad. They played against Na'Vi, a team that certainly was gradually rising. But beating LDLC is one thing. If you then go and you just lose straight up 2-0 to Na'Vi, that's not good enough. Like that shows like there's inconsistency in your results. There's not this pattern that you're going to become this elite level team. And obviously ESWC, remember, doesn't have the same pressure as majors. So actually, in theory, you should be more of an upset threat there. So that in itself shows that people overrated the other aspect a little bit. That was like the best case scenario was FaceIt Season 2. This tournament's more like an everyday type result. Then people forget this. They didn't keep that lineup until the end. They kicked DaZeD and Steel. They brought in, what happened was Swag and Skadoodle decided, you know what, we're going to kick DaZeD and Steel. We're going to bring in Nitro and Desi. And they went to the next major. And at the next major, they failed to get out the group stage. It was a group where, because Titan had Kaylee banned and they'd been kicked out of the tournament, the group got even easier, because then it was Copenhagen Wolves and Penta were the other teams in this group. And in this scenario, if they'd kept the old lineup together, I think they would have gotten out of this group. I think they would have made it to the playoffs for the first time in a major. And I think actually would have then been quite interesting to see how they would have done, because they would have played potentially. I mean, let's see who was available at that point in time. I think that they played. Let's see who would have been there. Was it LDLC? No, it can't have been LDLC. If first or second at that major, who would they have played? Because obviously Penta played against VP, I believe, and I think. Who was the other team in that group? I don't fucking know. It's not really that relevant anyway. But the point is, I think they would have been better with that. So the question is, why did they kick DaZeD and Steel? First of all, Steel supposedly, it wasn't going well with him. He was already thinking of leaving anyway at some point. He was going to play out the major, obviously. But otherwise, he was going to go. Like, there was clashes within the team. DaZeD, they kicked because they just thought he was an asshole. They didn't like to play with him anymore. They thought they grated on him too much, complained too much. So DaZeD, who people are holding up as the god tier in-game leader, they kicked him. They didn't want him in the team anymore. Then, after this tournament, they had ESEA Season 17 was briefly after the major. So after DreamHack Winter, we had ESEA Season 17, and the team finished third there, but they had Nitro in the team still. Desi they kicked out. They brought in a Dren just temporarily, because the Dren hadn't settled into Liquid yet, which was at the time Denial. And they finished third, but admittedly the third wasn't that impressive. Like, Titan obviously had to have their manager standing in because Kaylee and Kenny still almost carried them past iBUYPOWER. So then they re-added DaZeD instead of a Dren. And what happened now is, now you had what would have been the super team, which is Hiko left Cloud9, and he was in talks, and they basically added him rather than Nitro. That's who they were going between on the team, and they decided to go for Hiko, and they were going to make the super team. And the team played online in the qualifiers for MLG X Games Aspen, the first event of 2015, and they managed to qualify, but they actually lost in the online qualifier to Mouse Spaz, which is the lineup that became CLG for that tournament. So obviously we know later that team came good, but at the time they were just onliners. So first of all, it was already bad enough that they'd lost to them. That made people like, even though it was the first games of the lineup, like, are they really going to be that good? I thought they were going to dominate online like iBUYPOWER used to. They didn't. And then before we got to MLG X Games Aspen, it was already announced that they're not going there. They're not going to go to there. They'd left the iBUYPOWER org, and we know they were going to be picked up by Evil Geniuses, most probably. So they didn't attend the tournament. People say behind the scenes they were kind of told, like, yeah, don't go. Like, it's not a good thing for you right now. Valve was determining their fate because Richard Lewis had exposed that they'd done the match fixing months earlier with the old lineup. And a few days after MLG X Games Aspen, the team was banned. Everyone except Skadoodle of that original lineup was banned. So DaZeD was banned, Swag banned, AZK banned, Steel banned. For life. I mean, it said indefinitely, which technically means you can change it at any point in time. But actually, they meant that literally as in there's just no limit to the ban. Like, we're not. They even suggested in years later, we're not even going to really review this ban or look at it. So essentially, banned for life. Now, here's the thing. If we look at that original lineup, the DaZeD, Steel, Skadoodle, AZK, Swag lineup. Now, that lineup weren't Saviours of NA because they actually played, let's see how many international tournaments. So if we include ESEA season 16, they played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They played 5 international tournaments together. They had 1 final, 2 finals, and they had 2 top 8s, and they bombed in the group stage of 1. So not bad, but when you consider the circumstances of one of them, the season 16 one of ESEA, yeah, not that great. So good, but not incredible. In fact, actually, that's not that much better than what teams like Optic have done the last few months, you know. It's not like they did something exceptional in that particular way. Arguably, some of that's... Well, let's keep going with this anyway. So the point is, that lineup, if anything, had run its course. With the whole DaZeD and Steel thing, they might have been able to get Hiko and make the super team, but that lineup was done anyway. So that lineup weren't the Saviours. But then let's look at the team when they add in Hiko. Now, I agree on paper... that could be a very good team. They could do a lot with that team. But that's also a team where it's very uncertain how they would have done. Because, for example, adding in Hiko, okay, famously a lurker, he was, in theory, probably going to have to switch his role up because, arguably, Swag's the best lurker in that team. He's the guy who probably fits that role better. Then you've got to add in, they'd already had their issues with DaZeD, etc. You know, there was good potential for that team, but no one knows what it would have done. Would it have made it to the final of a major like Team Liquid did 2 years later? I don't know that you could reasonably say it would. Would they have won a massive international tournament like Optic did, E-League Season 2? I mean, it's potential as it could have, but would it have? Yeah, you'd probably go ahead and bet now that no. Like at the time, just making out of groups at majors, having a chance to win big best-of-3 series. So what Cloud9's already done at this point in time, what iBUYPOWER's already done at FaceIt Season 2. These are probably best case scenarios initially until you see what can develop and if there's some special synergy or somehow players work together. So that team and the super team, not necessarily Saviours in that particular respect, in light of what happened since. But then you go player by player, okay? So Swag, absolutely an obvious talent. One of the most talented players in NA. Someone who did pretty much consistently perform when he went to international tournaments. There's a problem with Swag, though. Due to being so young, and from whatever cultural environment Swag's from, he's not a very vocal player. Like, he's not the kind of player who'd make demands of certain things. He's not the kind of player who necessarily would play with people initially who he doesn't want to play with. It seems like in general he wants to play with the crowd that he thinks fits him, or people who have similar personality to him, or people he likes. Hence why he kicked out DaZeD and therefore sabotaged iBUYPOWER's whole chance of going deep at that major dream at Win 2014. And instead he brought in DaZeD and Nitro, and at the time they were both complete unknowns. DaZeD now isn't particularly super well known, but at the time he was pretty unknown, and Nitro was a complete unknown. He barely played at all, and these guys were just friends of Swag's essentially. So the fact he was willing to do that shows that, did he have the killer instinct? Did he have the drive that we all complain about Cloud9 not having now and not making the hard choices? We don't know if Swag did, actually. He might have just gone and spent the rest of his career playing with people like Nothing or other people that he liked and just chilling out on other good teams, and maybe he'd never have had that killer drive to be in the top team. Now, they got him to do the super team with Hiko, but Hiko's a pretty amiable person, despite what people said about what they thought that there's problems between him and Swag, etc. That's not the same. I mean, Swag himself took part in having DaZeD cut. Didn't want to play with him because he was too difficult to deal with, to just grilling them all the time in game, shouting at them, raging at them. So the issue here is it's no guarantee that despite Swag's talent that he would have gone far in CSGO. We'd hope so. You can't ever know though. Now you got to look at DaZeD. Now DaZeD is someone where I absolutely think DaZeD's potential was incredible. I think he's exactly the sort of person that, in terms of what he could do in the game individually and as a leader, I think he's probably the best candidate to be the best in-game leader in NA. The problem is his personality would always hold him back. In some ways, he was like the simple of in-game leaders. I mean, I actually wrote an article, be in the description box below. It was called DaZeD, A Complicated Man. And on one hand, I outline all of his problems. The fact he was kicked from teams and people didn't want to work with him, people thought he was an asshole, and that he had difficulty communicating with his teammates in a manner that was like helpful, and that he had a corrosive component to his personality. Now, with all that said, I closed the article by saying if an international team is ever going to win, if an NA team is ever going to win an international tournament, it will be with DaZeD in the line. I mean, unfortunately, I published this in like December 2014. He got banned in like beginning of February or the end of January 2015. But the point still held. I thought the potential was very good, but whether he could get with the right players, I didn't know. I mean, one thing's behind the scenes is, me and Hiko, when he came to lay Cloud9, this is one thing we always discussed. It's got to be you and DaZeD, right? You've got to get over your issues, because they had a good team back with Quantic at the beginning of 2013. You've got to get this these people back together and say, fuck those guys in Cloud9 who just want to play for fun and play with people they like and then hope they can win. So are only willing to win on their terms and haven't won. And let's get together the best players and hope that they can win in that sense. So that's the problem with DaZeD. You have to find people like Hiko who have the killer instinct to want to play with him and are willing to play with him. Because yes, he was a good in-game leader. Now, he wasn't a great in-game leader. He wasn't some godlike tactician or someone who had fantastic ability to develop players or could put any set of players together in a great formation. He's the guy who was a good in-game leader, who built a system and who could play with other good players. And his teams in general were skill-based teams that had very good players. And then he had to hope that he had elements within the team who'd be more supportive, like a TCK, etc. He wasn't necessarily going to get them automatically, or an AZK. So the problem with DaZeD is very contentious player. Someone where you look at his history. So when he had Quantic, they were a team having top placings internationally. And what happened to the team? They were torn in half, and off went Hiko, and off went... who was the other one who left in that scenario? Who would it... Semphis, yes. Semphis and Hiko. They obviously went off and became Complexity. That only happened because DaZeD essentially was his personality. That's it. That's why that team was torn apart. Then you had iBUYPOWER. Remember, I've just said second place FaceIt stage 2, season 2. Top 8 ESWC, top 8 Gfinity, winning ESEA LAN. His own team cut him. He was the in-game leader. He's the one who's orchestrated a lot of that. They cut him from the team. So you can see he already might have had a contentious career after that. There might have been very good players who didn't want to play with DaZeD. That's can't be taken for granted. Now let's go to Steel. Now I always make this point about Steel, even though I think he has a good mind for the game, and I certainly think he'd be a good candidate to be a good in-game leader. There's two things with Steel. One, first of all, he didn't do any top-level in-game leading in CSGO. He was an in-game leader from Source, as far as I'm aware. Secondly, he did a little bit of in-game leading with the Talk lineup, which was okay, and was trying to build his own project up after the iBUYPOWER kick, but they never got to the level where they were like some top international team or even playing internationally. So that's a big what-if as to if he could have even been a top in-game leader. You never know. There's people like Adren who have a fantastic mind for the game. In-game, though, in CSGO, doesn't work, or their personality doesn't fit it. Then you got to add in, Steel's a guy who can break the game down very well, but sometimes, again, he suffers a little bit from the DaZeD thing, where sometimes he complains a little bit too much, or he goes a little bit too hard at nitpicking things. And while that's great if you've got people who have the personality to improve in that way, I know a lot of in-game NA players, rather, who wouldn't like an in-game leader like that, who wouldn't want someone doing that sort of thing, or even worse, would just say, yeah, but you did a mistake here, and try and palm off the blame like that. So I don't know that there's that many NA players would fit that well with Steel in that particular sense. They might say they would now, because they never have to actually play a real tournament with him. And don't tell me, yeah, but he plays in Rank S, and so does they. I don't give a fuck about Rank S. It's nothing, it's not even vaguely in the same universe as playing tournament after tournament and having a run like we had in late 2014 where you go to 3 international tournaments in Europe and you have to sleep in the same room as a bunch of the guys and live with them for a month. No, that's very different to just being able to play a couple of hours for fun with a guy and have him do structured tactics. Then you've got to add in that he's someone where he'd already kind of shown he didn't want to play with the DaZeDs of the world. He didn't want to play with some of these other guys. He'd rather just go and do his own thing and build up his own little project. So maybe he would have been some cool Blade type figure who took your younger players and built them up, and some of them could occasionally go off. But would he have been in the top NA team? Would he have gone super ham in that way? We don't know, actually. We don't know if he had that drive to. Admittedly, the scene was different back then. There wasn't as much money and resources. So maybe that could have changed his mind, but we can never know. And he can't ever know himself because he can't be in that position again. Then you got to add in, forget the whole talk thing and being an in-game leader. This guy was the best observer in CSGO, arguably the best observer we ever had. He really had a good intuition for when to do things. As you saw in that video I'll put up there, he came up with a lot of the philosophies on how you're actually doing in-game observing and what concepts to go with that a lot of people learn from afterwards. Now, if I'm tournament organizers, I would have been hiring him for every major. I would have been hiring him for most of the big European tournaments. So if he was getting good money doing that and he was getting more opportunity doing that, maybe he would have just gone off into the world of observing anyway. And you got to add in, for someone like him, if he didn't want to play and be in a top team or couldn't be in a top team, maybe he would be a coach by now. Now, sure, as a coach, I think he could bring a lot. It's a shame that Valve doesn't allow DaZeD and Steel to be coaches, but that's not the same as being the in-game leader, which is what people think of as what his role would have been. So you can't put him as a savior, as an in-game leader in that respect. Then you've got to go to AZK. Now, AZK is a guy I always did think was pretty solid. He had a consistent game. I think he got a bit overrated as some sort of star player. People just always want to make every player of a good lineup into a star player. But I certainly think he was a very good piece that you could have had in some teams. But he was very much more of a soldier. He was more of a follower. He's a quiet guy. He's not someone who's going to necessarily make big calls or has the same sort of force within him when the game's going badly to have these discussions. So who knows what kind of lineup he would have fit with? Would he have wanted to play with DaZeD again, who he's just had cut? He's probably not going to play with Steel again, you'd assume, because, I mean, he's just split from Steel. He's had Steel's being kicked from the team as well. Steel's going to do his own project. So what, is he going to play with a Sean Gers? Sean Gers already got enough quiet people himself in the fucking server, got other people like that. Yeah, it's not a guarantee that this guy would be part of amazing success. He's certainly a good player, but you got to have something else. You got to find people that fit with you. You got to find people that balance out your personality. Or sometimes you got to have drive and ambition if you want to be a top level player and have top level success internationally. Remember the other members of the team. Skadoodle wasn't banned. So if you want to say the iBUYPOWER guys would have done it all, and if they hadn't been banned, right? If they weren't banned, there's no guarantee. In fact, it's almost certainly wouldn't happen that Skadoodle goes over to Cloud9 like he did. That happened because the others got banned. So without Skadoodle going to Cloud9, there is no run of 3 second places in the summer of 2015. Sean Gers doesn't get the same rep as being a godlike anti-strat tactician. He'd just be a good, pretty good in-game leader. You wouldn't have had the same success. You wouldn't have everything Cloud9 accomplished. You wouldn't have now EPL win practically. I mean, it's years later, so I guess he could have joined by then. But in theory, you need a lot of these actions to take place for similar things to occur. Then you've got to add in, if these players don't get banned, there is no Team Liquid with Hiko. That happened because he went off, he joined Neolum, and then Team Liquid gradually developed, and then he joined Team Liquid in the latter part of 2015. Now, if he doesn't do that, if Hiko doesn't go and join Team Liquid, Hiko joining Team Liquid, the reason I always said that Hiko was right thing is because Hiko leaving Cloud9 was a symbolic thing. It was also a literal gesture and a literal move, but it was also symbolic of Hiko deciding from this moment on, all I care about is winning and trying to be on the best team I can be on with the best players I can get and try and do the best I can internationally at majors. And that move, yes, it took a very circuitous route and it took over a year to find full success and get to where he wanted to go, better than what Cloud9 had accomplished at majors, but it happened eventually. And part of it was that mentality applied to Team Liquid started to weed out players from Team Liquid, started to force people to go into certain positions in Team Liquid, brought in coaching, brought in other elements, eventually brought in Simple to the lineup, the ultimate kind of hired gun mercenary type figure who ended up helping carry them to 2 top 4s of majors. And so as a result, you don't get those 2 semi-finals with Team Liquid without Simple coming in, and therefore you got charted back far enough without Hiko coming over, which wouldn't have happened if iBUYPOWER hadn't been banned. Then you got to add in, so there's no finals of Cologne without Hiko coming over. So all these great accomplishments since from NA actually stem back in terms of the Cloud9 and the Team Liquid ones to what happened with Hiko, with iBUYPOWER, and with them getting banned or not getting banned. And Skadoodle, obviously. Then you've got to consider, if there was enough money and resources like there is now, would DaZeD and Steel, like, would their attitudes change or would they find the right mix of players on themselves? It's all possible, but it's still a lot of question marks here. The point is, it could not happen also. And as a result, the rest of the scene would have to work itself out as it does now without them in the same respect anyway. I mean, let's look at some of the other successes NA had in the meantime. So CLG eventually managed, after some upsets internationally, eventually managed to actually go and make it to the top 8 of a major, MLG Columbus. Now, they did that without any of the players that were involved in the iBUYPOWER ban, obviously, because it's years later. But they never had any of those players anyway. So they were able to have their rise and do all that they did without needing those iBUYPOWER players and still make top 8 at a major. Optic had the biggest win in NA CSGO history, winning E-League Season 2, with a lineup entirely made up of people who not only had nothing to do with that iBUYPOWER team, not in any way connected, but were also under the iBUYPOWER team and the couple of teams after them back when iBUYPOWER was banned, and were able to come up, get chances, flourish, develop their players, and eventually get together a combo that was able to have the biggest accomplishment arguably in NA CSGO history. Do we know that this iBUYPOWER set of players would have done it? If they'd have fractured and gone to different teams, would they have done it? We can't say, whereas we know Optic did do it. So the problem with this whole scenario is people just exaggerate, and unfortunately I think they use iBUYPOWER and their bans and the indefinite nature of them as a mechanism to take away the blame and the responsibility and the fact that by saying, oh, well, I had this player, I had this in-game leader and this player, so Swag and DaZeD, I had them pre-packaged, they were already ready and they could have just slotted right in and been really good now. No one knows where those guys would be right now. And all the same problems would still exist in NA. So iBUYPOWER famously were really terrible in the way they practiced. If they could outskill people, they just disrespected them, shit on them with aim, didn't practice properly. They constantly said there's no good teams in NA, none of these teams are worth scrimming, so they just scrimmed like Cloud9 and then shit teams and wrecked them. Now, there was, Mousespaz was already there and instantly became a decent team on LAN when they got to the first tournament of 2015. Other players were around. The players that eventually became Tempo Storm into the team that became Optic, they were around. Then you have the players that were in denial that became Team Liquid. They were around. But no, these teams didn't have respect for them, didn't work to develop these players, didn't practice the way the proper European teams practice against each other. And in some senses, you could argue were holding the scene back even initially. And those teams might have flourished as a result of iBUYPOWER being banned. Then you got to add in, people don't like when players play too much rank S. And as a result, they just learn to play in a scrimmy fashion. Both Cloud9 and iBUYPOWER did this all the time. iBUYPOWER just shot on you with terms of aim. Cloud9, because of Semphis, famously just sabotaged scrims and didn't play them properly and played with disrespect, etc. Then you got to add in, iBUYPOWER was filled with skilled players in their best lineup and actually showed a massive reluctance until Swag took it into his own hands to pick up younger talents and to try them out. And I remember when Nitro was picked up that team, people were like, what the fuck are they doing? I was like that myself. Little did we know, the next year, Nitro would eventually become one of the best NA players. Guys like Stewie G3 were out there in theory. We didn't know them at the time, but you have to be willing to, some people have to take chances on these guys and develop them and put them in positions to potentially succeed. iBUYPOWER and Cloud9 had a hegemony at the top of the scene and didn't look at the scene that way. They said, there aren't good players out there. We're the best by far. They're the only other good team. We don't even like them that much. And fuck everyone else. No one's as good. And it's like the fact that they lost to international teams, they then took that and their way of feeling good about themselves was, well, we're better than all these shitters below us in NA. There's no one else good here in that sense. Then you've got to add in, there were a bunch of players in both teams who at the time lacked motivation. And we're like, okay, things are going well, but there's no one we can pick up. And how can we practice? And we don't have enough money yet. And so all the same issues that plague every team, and some of those have even been fixed, like the money issue and the practice issue and the sponsorship issue. Some of them have been fixed, but the other problems haven't been fixed. So developing other players, having other in-game leaders come in, have people break the paradigms and the molds of how you thought. Some of that's been done now and wasn't done because those guys were in place, the old school guys. So I certainly think if you took those players and you put them in the right teams and you gave them more years of their career to have a crack at it, yes, they could have accomplished great things. They might have even accomplished the greatest things we haven't seen from NA teams yet. But a lot has been done by NA in the meantime that should be given credit. Team Liquid, Optic, Cloud9. And then you've got to consider that it's no guarantee these guys would have done. We don't know where they would have been. And there were a lot of flaws and factors to each player and what their history was before they were banned and what might have happened afterwards that can't be taken for granted that they would have been the saviours of NA.